You won't believe what happened next. The world paused, not for a movie premiere, not for a scandal, but for a quiet woman whose laugh changed how we look at being human. Diane Keaton. She began life without a spotlight. Born Diane Hall on the 5th of January 1946 in Los Angeles, she grew up in a house where smiles were polished and feelings were locked away. Her mother, Dorothy, once the kind of woman who lit up a stage, folded her dreams into domestic life. Her father, Jack, liked order. Young Diane learned quickly that speaking your heart wasn't always allowed. So she learned a different language: acting. It wasn't about applause at first. It was about surviving the hush. At 20, she took a Greyhound to New York with a single battered suitcase and a stubborn refusal to disappear. The city was cruel and magnificent. She slept in a drafty apartment, waited tables, sang in smoky basements, and read scripts until her eyes blurred. Hunger and rejection sharpened her. Then, finally, the break. A raw theatrical role that didn't want a polished actress. It wanted truth. The director said, "Don't change a thing." She didn't. For the first time, the trembling that used to feel like fear turned into the thing that made people look up. Hollywood followed. She wasn't built like a classical movie star, and that's why she changed everything. In The Godfather, she was the soft center in a hard world. In Annie Hall, she turned awkward pauses, eccentric style, and that shy laugh into a new kind of bravery. When she held that Oscar, she didn't feel finished. She felt more visible and more fragile than ever. Fame shone bright, and like all bright things, it cut. She worked like someone afraid to stop. She dug into roles with a kind of hunger that left her hollow at times. Critics called her fearless, and often she agreed, not because she wanted to be brave, but because she had learned to make art out of scar tissue. Then, the mid-1980 seconds came like a slow winter. Parts dried up, reviews cooled, and she chose to step back, rather than surrender to parts that felt dishonest. She wrote, directed, photographed. She kept making, quietly. Her creativity outlasted the noise. Diane Keaton. But the story beyond the camera is the one that people who loved her will remember most. At 50, she adopted a daughter, Dexter, and a few years later, a son, Duke. Suddenly, the woman who'd learned to survive in silence learned how to rebuild herself with bedtime songs and messy breakfasts. She made a home out of imperfect routines, burnt toast, scribbled notes on mirrors, and movies on the couch. Those ordinary things saved her in a way red carpets never could. To her kids, she was less icon, more heartbeat. Even as she aged, she refused to vanish into some Hollywood idea of graceful decline. She wore her quirks like medals, hats, odd pauses, a voice that could break and heal a scene all at once. Off-screen, she remembered people's names. She treated crew like family. She'd say, "Let's make something honest," and people believed her. Her creative life stretched into photography and small keepsakes, frames capturing sunlight, a lifetime of small miracles. Goldie Hawn. There was one friendship that everyone noticed the sunlight to her quiet. Goldie Hawn. They met on a set in the 1990 seconds, and what started as two actresses doing their job turned into something like Sanctuary. Goldie, effervescent and open, would walk into a trailer and untuck Diane's armor. Diane, deliberate and true, gave Goldie a steadiness she could lean on. They promised each other something tender. Let's grow old together. It was not fame's fancy. It was a pact between two people who'd watched Hollywood try to break them and decided to keep one another whole. When Diane's health declined, Goldie's grief wasn't spectacle. It was a soft, private, unraveling the kind that leaves you hollow but somehow more honest. At a Deverett, small memorial, Goldie stood with a single white rose and spoke in a voice that trembled like glass. She didn't try to sum up a life in headlines. She remembered the lunches, the shared silences, the late-night phone calls. She pledged to laugh for both of them because laughter, for Diane, had always been a form of resistance. In Diane's last months, she retreated from a world she'd once loved into quiet places she'd always loved. Palm Springs, bare feet on cool tile, sunlight and wind, a camera on a windowsill capturing the last ordinary things she loved. Friends like Carol Bayer Sager watched her carry on making art, even as her body grew tired. She framed the small, ordinary images of living and left them as a private diary, photographs that meant more than any headline. The news of her passing on the 11th of October 2025 felt like an impossibly large silence. Lights dimmed at theaters, hashtags trended, and actors remembered that she'd taught them something few ever do: how to age without apology, how to be strange and tender at once. Fans left hats at her gate. People posted tiny stories. She made me brave enough to be myself. That kind of tribute is both simple and endless. Here's what made her different. She turned vulnerability into vocabulary. She taught the world that being imperfect didn't make you smaller, it made your work larger. She showed up when the cameras left, rewrote lines at 3 in the morning, and sat in quiet with crew members who needed a name remembered. Her work didn't just entertain. It uncorked something in the people who watched her permission to be messy, loud, old, and honest. So what do we do now, after the credits roll on her life? We don't pretend she's gone. We listen for the laugh that used to fill rooms. We let silence be a tribute, not an absence. We tell the people we love that their quirks matter. We keep the small rituals, the burnt toast, the camera that sits by the window, and we make art where there was none before. If Diane's life taught us anything, it's this: bravery looks a lot like showing up as you are. It's not always dramatic. Often, it's quiet and stubborn and funny. So, when you think of her, don't only remember the films or the hats. Remember the way she made silence feel holy. In the weeks that followed her passing, Hollywood tried to summarize Diane Keaton in headlines: icon, legend, trailblazer, but none of those words fit the woman who always refused labels. The truth was gentler. She was a reminder that art doesn't come from perfection. It comes from persistence. The same trembling hands that once gripped a coffee cup in nervousness later held an Oscar. The same woman who doubted her worth in auditions became the reason generations of actors found theirs. Every mistake, every silence, every awkward laugh, she turned it all into poetry on screen. And perhaps that's her truest legacy. Diane didn't leave behind an empire or a brand. She left behind permission to be yourself, in a world that keeps asking you to be someone else. Somewhere, tonight, a young actor will stand under harsh lights, hands shaking, and choose to speak anyway. Somewhere, a woman will look in the mirror, hat tilted just so, and smile without apology. That's Diane Keaton's forever. If this moved you, leave a heart, share a memory. And if you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe. Let's keep laughing for her, and for all of us who are still learning how.